Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. Today we're continuing on in our series called the Super Cool Stories, where we're looking at various stories of the Bible and the lessons that we can learn from them. And today we're looking at the story of Samson and Delilah. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the Old Testament, there was a period of time where instead of being ruled by kings, the Israelites were ruled by judges. This means that they didn't have all those well-organized armies under a good guy like King David, for instance, to protect them, which meant that they were susceptible to attacks from their enemies, for instance, the Philistines. This is where Samson comes in. God raised him up to be one of Israel's judges, and primarily to be a tool in his hand to punish the Philistines. Why? Because that's all that really Samson was good for. Now, when it comes to super cool stories, not always is the main character the most important character, and that's a truth in this story. For instance, Samson's mom happens to be quite an important character in this story, and yet her name is never mentioned. Judges 13:1. Again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, so the Lord handed them over to the Philistines, who oppressed them for 40 years. In those days, a man named Manoah from the tribe of Dan lived in the town of Zorah. His wife was unable to become pregnant, and they had no children. The angel of the Lord appeared to Manoah's wife and said, "Even though you have been unable to have children, you will soon become pregnant and give birth to a son. So be careful. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food. You will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and his hair must never be cut, for he will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. He will begin to rescue Israel from the Philistines." The woman ran and told her husband, "A man of God appeared to me. He looked like one of God's angels, terrifying to see. I didn't ask where he was from, and he didn't tell me his name, but he told me, 'You will become pregnant and give birth to a son. You must not drink wine or any other alcoholic drink, nor eat any forbidden food, for your son will be dedicated to God as a Nazirite from the moment of his birth until the day of his death.' When her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir him while he lived in Mahanadan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol." For those who don't know, this requirement that this angel made of this woman was longer than just the 9 months of the pregnancy. This would have been a requirement of her to live under this dietary restriction during the entire time that Samson was nursing. And then after that, during the time prior to him being really weaned, which may have been in the early teens, it would have still been her job to make sure that he was living the right way and living according to the way that a Nazirite vow would ask of him. Which leads us to this lesson: not all heroes get recognized. Meaning you and I might be playing a role right now in God's plan that is incredibly important, but we're not getting any recognition, or nobody's really paying attention to that part. Somebody else is getting all the attention, and that's okay. There are going to be times where that's going to happen, and God always knows. God knew that this woman's heart was ready for this task, and that's the reason why he came to her and gave her this blessing. Now, unfortunately, Samson was not up to the task. In fact, Samson was not like his mama at all. He was not dedicated. In fact, he was bombastic and brash and a little bit of a brat. In fact, look at what we're told happened next. Judges 14:1. One day when Samson was in Timnah, one of the Philistine women caught his eye. When he returned home, he told his father and mother, "A young Philistine woman in Timnah caught my eye. I want to marry her. Get her for me." His father and mother objected. "Isn't there even one woman in our tribe or among all the Israelites you could marry?" they asked. "Why must you go to the pagan Philistines to find a wife?" But Samson told his father, "Get her for me. She looks good to me." His father and mother didn't realize the Lord was at work in this, creating an opportunity to work against the Philistines, who ruled over Israel at that time. As Samson and his parents were going down to Timnah, a young lion suddenly attacked Samson near the vineyards of Timnah. At that moment, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon him, and he ripped the lion's jaws apart with his bare hands. He did it as easily as if it were a young goat, but he didn't tell his father or mother about it. When Samson arrived in Timnah, he talked with the woman and was very pleased with her. Later, when he returned to Timnah for the wedding, he turned off the path to look at the carcass of the lion, and he found that a swarm of bees had made some honey in the carcass. He scooped some of the honey into his hands and ate it along the way. He also gave some to his father and mother, and they ate it, but he didn't tell them that he had taken the honey from the carcass of the lion. Let's stop here so I can point out something. According to the Mosaic law, touching that lion carcass made Samson unclean, and it violated God's law, and he knew this, and then he intentionally gave some of that honey to his mom and his dad, which means he also included them in this violation intentionally. And he did so without really even thinking about the consequences or what this reprimand would mean from God. And so the author is clearly telling us that Samson has no concern whatsoever for what it is that God's law really is, and he really is disrespecting his parents in any respect that they may have for the law as well. Which leads us to the next lesson in this story, which is Samson wasn't heroic or smart. Meaning, regardless of what the children's books say, Samson is no hero. In fact, he was so consumed with his own desires that he put everybody else around him at risk without any really concern, even for family. That's not what heroes do. Heroes put themselves at risk for others, especially family, and they don't flippantly hurt or harm them while chasing their own whims. Another example of this idiotic behavior of Samson, or unheroic behavior of Samson, happened at this same wedding. You see, Samson, being a narcissist, decided to bet some of his fiance's close friends that they couldn't solve this riddle. Out of the one who eats came something to eat. Out of the strong came something sweet. Of course, these guys couldn't figure it out, so they went to his fiancée, Samson's fiancée, and they got her to nag him to the point of explanation. And once Samson figured this out, he went ahead and paid the debt for that, but then he stormed away from the wedding without telling anybody why or considering the consequences for it. And then a few months later, this happens. Judges 15:1. Later on, during the wheat harvest, Samson took a young goat as a present to his wife. He said, "I'm going into my wife's room to sleep with her." But her father wouldn't let him. "I truly thought you must hate her," her father explained. "So I gave her in marriage to your best man. But look, her younger sister's even more beautiful than she is. Marry her instead." Samson said, "This time I cannot be blamed for everything I am going to do to you Philistines." Then he went out and caught 300 foxes. He tied their tails together in pairs, and he fastened a torch to each pair of tails. Then he lit the torches and let the foxes run through the grain fields of the Philistines. He burned all their grain to the ground, including the sheaves and the uncut grain. He also destroyed their vineyards and olive groves. "Who did this?" the Philistines demanded. "Samson," was the reply, "because his father-in-law from Timnah gave Samson's wife to be married to his best man." So the Philistines went and got the woman and her father and burned them to death. "Because you did this," Samson vowed, "I won't rest until I take my revenge on you." So he attacked the Philistines with great fury and killed many of them. Then he went to live in a cave in the rock of Edom. Unfortunately, this is just a small sample of the idiocy of Samson. But for those of you who really know the story, you know that his idiocy was exploited to a whole new level by a woman named Delilah. So let's get to that part of the story. Judges 16:4. Sometime later, Samson fell in love with a woman named Delilah who lived in the valley of Sorek. The rulers of the Philistines went to her and said, "Entice Samson to tell you what makes him so strong and how he can be overpowered and tied up securely. Then each of us will give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me what makes you so strong and what it would take to tie you up securely." Samson replied, "If I were tied up with 7 new bowstrings that have not yet been dried, I would become as weak as anyone else." So the Philistine rulers brought Delilah 7 new bowstrings, and she tied Samson up with them. She had hidden some men in one of the inner rooms of her house, and she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you!" But Samson snapped the bowstrings as a piece of string snaps when it is burned by fire. So the secret of his strength was not discovered. Afterward, Delilah said to him, "You've been making fun of me and telling me lies. Now please tell me, how can you be tied up securely?" Samson replied, "If I were tied up with brand new ropes that had never been used, I would become as weak as anyone else." So Delilah took new ropes and tied him up with them. The men were hiding in the inner room as before, and again Delilah cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you!" But again Samson snapped the ropes from his arms as if they were thread. Then Delilah said, "You have been making fun of me and telling me lies. Now tell me how you can be tied up securely." Samson replied, "If you were to weave the 7 braids of my hair into the fabric on your loom and tighten it with the loom shuttle, I would become as weak as anyone else." So while he slept, Delilah wove the 7 braids of his hair into the fabric. Then she tightened it with the loom shuttle, and again she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you." But Samson woke up, pulled back the loom shuttle, and yanked his hair away from the loom and the fabric. Then Delilah pouted. "How can you tell me I love you when you don't share your secrets with me? You've made fun of me 3 times now, and you still haven't told me what makes you so strong." She tormented him with her nagging day after day until he was sick to death of it. I honestly don't know how Samson could be so daft that he couldn't figure out that this woman, Delilah, was not really a good woman. Which leads us to the next lesson in this story, which is God doesn't always use smart people. Meaning there are times when God will use someone who is incredibly dense to get his will accomplished. And Samson is obviously a perfect example of this. Another good example of this is Jonah, who was equally as hard-headed as Samson, just not as strong. And in both cases, God knew that what he had to work through was both their attitudes and their agendas, but he was up to the task, meaning God knew that he had to bring them both to a breaking point where ultimately they would learn, it's really not a good idea to disobey God's will, especially when he has made it so clear. Well, this is what happened to Samson next. Judges 16:17. Finally, Samson shared his secret with her. "My hair has never been cut," he confessed, "for I was dedicated to God as a Nazirite from birth. If my head were shaved, my strength would leave me and I would become as weak as anyone else." Delilah realized he had finally told her the truth, so she sent for the Philistine rulers. "Come back one more time," she said, "for he has finally told me his secret." So the Philistine rulers returned with the money in their hands. Delilah lulled Samson to sleep with his head in her lap, and then she called in a man to shave off the 7 locks of his hair. In this way, she began to bring him down, and his strength left him. Then she cried out, "Samson, the Philistines have come to capture you!" When he woke up, he thought, "I will do as before and shake myself free." But he didn't realize the Lord had left him. So the Philistines captured him and gouged out his eyes. They took him to Gaza, where he was bound with bronze chains and forced to grind grain in the prison. But before long, his hair began to grow back. The Philistine rulers held a great festival, offering sacrifices and praising their god Dagon. They said, "Our God has given us victory over our enemy Samson." When the people saw him, they praised their God, saying, "Our God has delivered our enemy to us. The one who killed so many of us is now in our power." Half drunk by now, the people demanded, "Bring out Samson so he can amuse us." So he was brought from the prison to amuse them, and they had him stand between the pillars supporting the roof. Samson said to the young servant who was leading him by the hand, "Place my hands against the pillars that hold up the temple. I want to rest against them." Now the temple was completely filled with people. All the Philistine rulers were there, and there were about 3,000 men and women on the roof who were watching as Samson amused them. Then Samson prayed to the Lord, "Sovereign Lord, remember me again. Oh God, please strengthen me just one more time. With one blow, let me pay back the Philistines for the loss of my 2 eyes." Then Samson put his hands on the 2 center pillars that held up the temple. Pushing against them with both hands, he prayed, "Let me die with the Philistines." And the temple crashed down on the Philistine rulers and all the people. So he killed more people when he died than he had during his entire lifetime. So there you have it, people. After exiting the care of his parents, and specifically the care of his mama, who was unnamed, Samson lived an entire life filled with reckless behavior, with little or no regard for anyone, including God, other than himself. And ultimately, at the end of his life, it is taken at his own hand, and the reason for it and his justification is because, well, they gouged out his eyes. So, at the beginning of this, I said that God used Samson as a tool in his hand to punish the Philistines, and the reason why is because that's all really that Samson was good for. This brings us to the last lesson in this story, which is this: we need to be better than Samson. Meaning, even though God did use Samson to kill a lot of Philistines, every other opportunity that Samson had to live a godly life, he rejected it. I mean, think about it like this. When it came to respecting his parents, he blew that. Remember the whole honey situation? When it came to respecting his culture, he blew that. Remember, "Oh, I want to marry that Philistine woman and have sex with her just because she's pretty." And then there was the whole disrespect toward God, i.e. the flippant disclosure of what it was that gave him his power to Delilah, of all people. All of this indicates that Samson is the kind of individual that when it comes to Scripture, this is not the kind of person that we should be emulating. So therefore, any telling of the story of Samson that tries to glorify him is missing the point. We are to be better than Samson. So, What have we learned in this super cool story? Well, hopefully what we've learned is that not every single hero is going to be recognized. Samson's mom wasn't, and she played an incredibly important role in this story. So if you and I are playing an important role in God's plan right now, but you don't feel like you're really getting any attention, or nobody's really talking about it or mentioning your name, it's okay. God knows. He knows that you're up to the task, and he knows that you're being heroic. Now, we also learned that Samson was no hero. Heroes sacrifice themselves for others. Samson didn't do that. He had a flippant disregard for everybody, including God. However, we also learned that God doesn't always use smart or heroic people. Sometimes he uses idiots, like Samson, or like Jonah, or like me, or maybe like you. He does. And he is up to the task. He knows that in spite of our attitudes or our agendas, he can take us to a breaking point and help us to learn what it means to be obedient to his will. Which ultimately leads us to the last lesson in this, is that we've got to be better than Samson. Our usefulness to God has got to be better than what Samson's was. I mean, think about it. Ultimately, Samson never really got to a place where he understood what it was that God wanted from him until the last. And so, ultimately, what you and I need to do is make sure that our epitaphs say more than, "Sure killed a lot of Philistines."